to produce many of the barbs and tetras for the home aquarium.
What we're looking at here are hundreds and hundreds of baby tiger barbs. The way that we spawn most of the barbs and tetras, a male and female are put into a small tank, in this instance a 2.5 gallon aquarium, with a brush. And the brush, the nylon brush, simulates really plant material or the substrate that the fish uses for spawning. Usually these types of fish lay adhesive eggs, and they lay them on strands of plants. These brushes function as artificial plants, and we use the brushes because there's lots of surface area for the eggs to adhere to, and because these are easily sterilized in between each breeding.
Rows of hundreds of tanks house the breeders. We can see the number system scrawled on the tanks.
If the conditions are right, they usually lay the eggs pretty quickly. When we see the row here, our tanks are marked 1, 2, 3. These are fish the ones are fish that spawned the first day after introduction. In other words, we put them in there in the afternoon, next morning we have eggs. And that tells us that that is a good breeder fish. So all of the ones and all of the twos become, for the next spawn, that group of our best breeders. And they will be ready to spawn again in 30 days.
A totally different method is employed for the egg scatterers, the zebra danios. A unique mesh basket is used to produce millions of eggs in a very small space.
Okay, we just took a look at the way that we spawn fish that breed in pairs, a single male and a female together. There is a large group of fish that are popular in the hobby called danios, zebra danios, giant danios. These fish are popular because they're very sturdy fish, they're inexpensive, and the reason that they're inexpensive is they're very easy to spawn, and they spawn in large numbers. Their fry are very sturdy, so you don't have to pay a lot of money for a danio at a pet store as compared to a barb or a lot of the tetras. And these fish spawn in mass numbers. They're called gang spawners. In the wild, a lot of these fish get into one area and huddle in that area when the water conditions are right. The females start releasing the eggs, and then the males start releasing the sperm. So it's not as intimate as one-on-one. It's more of a large-scale operation. The way that we simulate that here, and the way that the other thing that happens out in the wild is these fish will immediately turn around and start eating the eggs because there's so many eggs filling up the water, and they're very hungry after their activity. And we have the same, we really have to prevent that here in a production situation. The way that we do that is with a basket inside an aquarium. So the fish are introduced into a large mesh basket. This mesh basket allows the eggs to fall through to the bottom of the aquarium, and then of course the fish cannot get to the eggs. So the way that the fish are introduced, or the way we spawn danios, is these baskets are placed in small, shallow aquariums. Since these aquariums are going to have so many fish in them, we will typically put 200 or 300 fish in this tank as opposed to 2 down there. So this tank has to have a lot of surface area.
Since these fish breed in vast numbers and the fish grow to maturity very quickly, the zebra danio is one of the least expensive fish in the retail store.
When the sun comes up the next morning, these fish will immediately start spawning. It's the light coming up that encourages them to spawn. And again, these fish have been kept separated, males in one vat, females in the other, so they haven't seen each other for a month. And you put them all together in the basket. You put it late in the evening so that tomorrow morning as the sun comes up, as soon as it starts to come up, they start spawning. We come along that afternoon. They don't continue to spawn over a couple of day period like the smaller pairing fish do. It's pretty quick. It's within a couple of hours. They're finished. Might as well take them out. So this makes it very easy to remove 300 adult fish at one time. In the operation that you just saw, we have to go in with a net and catch each one of those breeding pairs. And a typical pond will be a setup of 500 breeding pairs. So we have one person going along with a net, catching a male, catching the parents out, one tank at a time times 500. That's production cost. That's why you pay more for a tiger barb at your pet store than you do for a zebra danio.
One of the most unusual breeding habits of tropical fish are the bubble nest builders. It is also dangerous for the fish and time-consuming for the breeder. Gouramis and paradise fish are among the bubble nest breeders and are some of the most beautiful and most expensive tropical fish as a result of these obstacles.
Okay, so far we've looked at adhesive spawners, those fish that lay their eggs that stick to something. We've looked at burrowers or substrate spawners like the plecostomus that dig into the side of a bank or dig a hole and put their eggs in. We've looked at the gang spawners that really don't care. There's no nest production. They have so many eggs, they don't need to prepare a nest or take care of them. They just drop them and go. We're going to look at next the bubble nest builders. These are air-breathing fish that have the capacity to utilize air. They're from a group called the anabantoids. And these are fish that you see for sale that are gouramis, dwarf gouramis, giant gouramis, blue gouramis. These are all very, very popular fish because they're very sturdy fish. These are fish, and they're pretty, they're big, and they're not really, really that expensive. The way that we breed those here is, again, the males and females are kept separately until it's time to spawn. Then one pair is put into a tank individually. You'll notice that there are no brushes here. We don't need those because all of the eggs are going to be laid at the surface of the water. And what the fish needs to begin, the male constructs a bubble nest. He blows a bubble, adheres them together, and what helps him adhere those bubbles together is a starting point. Out in nature, they'll use a leaf, a floating leaf, or a twig, something that creates some surface tension so the eggs stick together. Well, we have a wonderful invention here, and it's called a tiny piece of styrofoam. A lot of research dollars went into to coming up with that device, but this always floats, it can be sanitized, and it's a wonderful starting point for the nest. So it's really the same procedure as before. The pairs are introduced, we start checking them for eggs. Now, this is a little bit longer process because they have to construct the nest. Well, even though it's a small fish in body, it's not small when it comes time to breed. Here we have a male and a female dwarf gourami. These are beautiful fish. The male has the color, the bright reds and the bright blues. You can see what he looks like there. And my hand, the upper hand, we have a female who's ready to spawn. Look at the size of that fish. I think she has a few eggs that are ready to be released. So this is why this small fish can produce so many babies.
A very wide variety of tropical fish build nests and sometimes exhibit parental care for their young. These are the fish of the family cichlid, most of which are comparatively difficult to breed and therefore more expensive to purchase. One fine example is the sclera, or freshwater angelfish. Lonnie briefly tells us of its behavior and complicated breeding procedures.
Another very, very common aquarium fish, beautiful fish, popular, is the angelfish. And angelfish breed a little differently than anything that we've seen so far. For one thing, the fish has to be much bigger. They are a big fish at maturity, so they require a bigger aquarium. They are also, they're set up a pair in an aquarium, but instead of scattering adhesive eggs into a plant or a brush like we looked at, or laying them on the bottom or in a bubble nest, what angelfish do is lay their eggs in small clusters. They're very adhesive, and they like to stick them to something, a solid surface. Out in the wild, this may be a wide plant leaf. They really like plant that have a wide leaf that they can lay the eggs on. It can also be a rock or a piece of wood. Some very interesting things about angelfish. Angelfish are in the cichlid family. Cichlids are a very popular type of freshwater aquarium fish, and often people like their cichlids because they have personalities. And that's very true. The cichlids become a little more domesticated than a danio. It's a fish that has a much longer lifespan than a danio. Out in the wild, a danio may make it 18 months. They're sort of an annual fish. And so they don't have a lot of reasoning power. They're much, I'm probably applying too many human characteristics here, but they're just a very different animal from the cichlid family and from the angelfish. You can see that the angels become very accustomed to being fed. They come to the front of the tank. They start to recognize you when you walk in the room. And you're not just, if you have a friend that has an aquarium, they're not crazy when they say that, when you hear them say that, because these fish do actually respond very well to captivity. They're a little more intelligent fish, and because they have a lot longer lifespan. Out in the wild, these fish could live 5+ years. If they don't undergo predation, they could live 10 years. Angelfish, as are many other cichlids in a production facility, lay their eggs on a piece of material. And in this case, we use tile. The fish, as we looked at before, lays the eggs on the tile. We then remove that so that the parents can't eat the eggs or cannot eat the fry. And we then move those eggs into a tank of water with a lot of circulation in it, but not too much, good circulation, and an antibacterial solution, in this case methylene blue. This keeps the eggs from fungusing, and so most of them will hatch. As with the other fish, they become free swimming in 48 to 72 hours. They've absorbed their yolk sac, and then they're moved to the grow-out vats.
As Lonnie told us, from this point, many of the babies are moved into the biologically rich outdoor ponds, which can be used to rear the young fish just about year-round here in South Florida. After 8 weeks to almost 6 months, depending on the fish species, they are harvested through a process known as raking, which is done by hand with 2 men and a special raking net. Up to hundreds of thousands of fish are harvested out of each of the 450 ponds in staggered intervals. The fish are then collected and put in special vats on a custom truck and transported back to the indoor facility's acclimation vats, the first step on their long journey to your local pet store.
We mentioned the use of salt on the fish farm here for raising the brine shrimp. Salt is also a very, very important substance in the care of tropical fish. Salt helps fish osmoregulate. Now, what is osmoregulation? Fish are pretty complex because they're swimming in water. They have to keep their internal chemistry just right. It's a constant battle against water in freshwater fish, the water trying to get into their body. And salt is one of the things that helps in this regulation process, again, called osmoregulation. So salt is very important from that standpoint. It can really help relieve stress on a fish when it's being transported from one place to another. It sort of helps calm the fish down because it gives them, makes it so they don't have to work so hard to osmoregulate. Salt for us here on the fish farm also plays another very important role, and that is when we harvest fish and bring them in, or when we're handling our breeders. You're constantly rubbing off that little bit of slime that's on the outside of a fish. That's a very, very important mechanism for the fish, in that's their first line of defense against disease, against parasites, against bacterial infection. This slime is sort of their liquid skin, and you rub that off anytime you handle a fish, especially with a net. So we use salt on fish that have just come in from the field. We put them in a freshwater fish now we're talking, put them in a pretty heavy salt bath, and then gradually rinse that out. And it really helps the fins regenerate more quickly. It helps, the salt causes the skin cells to secrete more of the slime, so it replaces a lot of that slime that we've just rubbed off with our large seining nets. The other thing that salt does is it's sort of an antibacterial, and it helps keep down bacteria in the water as well. So that's why salt is extremely important to use for us here at an aquaculture facility. It's also important to use in the home aquarium. The thing to remember is salt never goes away. So if you're not doing a water change, if you're throwing salt into your aquarium because you just got new fish, so you're putting a couple tablespoons of it into a 10-gallon tank, and next week you go out and buy more fish, remember that that's cumulative until you do a water change. Water evaporates, but the salt doesn't. So you don't want to turn your freshwater aquarium into a saltwater aquarium. This is the final step for the fish on our farm. They're being packaged now to go to your local pet store or to a distributor who sells to the local pet store. The fish have been counted out of the holding facility, the acclimation facility. They've been counted out per each order. Each order has a tag on the bag, so we make sure that the right fish get in the right box. What our crew is doing here now is putting the fish into fresh, clean water. The water is colored because there's an antibacterial in there to keep the water cleaner during shipping, to protect the fish. There's also a little bit of a tranquilizer in there to slow the fish down. And pure oxygen is used because that will enable the fish to stay for a much longer period of time than just air. Some of the fish have very sharp fins that will poke through the bags, and for those fish we use a plastic bag and then wrap newspaper around the interior bag and put an outer bag on as well. And again, those are for fish that have very sharp fins that would deflate the bag during shipping. The fish are shipped in large styrofoam boxes that are inside cardboard boxes, and they are shipped via air freight, air cargo. Generally, these fish will be in the box anywhere from 12 hours to 24 hours before they are unpacked by the customer. However, the fish are packed out and shipped, packaged in a manner that if there's a flight delay or some problem, they can actually live in these bags at least 48 hours. Right. Well, the comment was that these guys run into the same thing you do when they go to the airport. Missed flights, cancellations, delays. The only difference is they don't have to take their shoes off at the security counter.
Now medicated, bagged with sufficient air for the long trip, and boxed in a climate-controlled package, our young fish are transported to the international airport for a trip. We have seen how these fascinating pets are bred, raised, and shipped. Now let's take a look at the special care taken when they arrive at your local pet store.
No, this isn't it. Was there salt stuff?
We talked to Chris Rutherford, a respected pet shop owner in Central Florida, and got an idea of the inner workings of a tropical fish retailer and how modern equipment takes most of the guesswork out of providing healthy fish for your home aquarium.
Our fish come off the truck in temperature-controlled packages, so we want to get them into our tanks as soon as possible.